Hello everybody. I'd like to do a video today and do a little reminiscing about the Second World War. In 1941, I was around 4 years old. And when the war ended in 1945, I was either 7 or 8, in that ballpark. But as a 4-year-old, I was aware enough of some of the things that were happening. I didn't know exactly what it was all about, but I knew the adults, especially my father and mother, were really interested in current events. We lived in a mining camp in Anthers, Tennessee. We lived in a company house that was built by the coal company. And if that house had any insulation in it, I don't know it. It was cold. We had a grate, what we called a grate in each room, and we burned coal. But I'm not going to go into that part. That's a whole different story. I wanted to talk about remembering the Second World War. In the living room, of course, all the radios back then were humongous. At 4 years old, the radio that we had was probably not as big as I thought it was. But it was a tube-type radio, and I can remember my dad tuning in that radio to get news of the war. And there was a voice that I have never been able to get out of my mind. And it was a voice from a reporter by the name of Gabriel Heater. Now I'm going to put a link in the description of this video, and if you want to hear some commentary and news reports from Gabriel Heater, someone has put most of his stuff out there on YouTube, and I'm going to link to one specific video, and more than likely I heard it as a young boy. In the newspaper out of Knoxville, it was the Knoxville News Sentinel, and I could hardly wait for that paper to be delivered because there was a comic strip called Smilin' Jack. And of course, Smilin' Jack was a pilot, and he was involved in the Second World War. Of course, at 4 years old, I could understand a few words, but I always had someone to read it to me. So I could hardly wait for Smilin' Jack to be delivered. And I followed Smilin' Jack throughout the war. Of course, by the time the war ended, the Second World War ended, we had moved away from the mining camp. My dad went to work in Oak Ridge. And I was around 7 or 8 years old, and I was a lot more educated then and knew more about what was going on than I did when I was about 4 years old. I could always listen for airplanes as they flew over. Now, when we lived in the mining camp, we lived kind of down between the mountains, so you didn't have much of a view of the horizon, and usually the only glimpse that you would get from an airplane, and I might say some of this stuff I've covered years ago in one of my old YouTube accounts, but I have so many different and new subscribers now that I'm just reiterating some things that I have talked about before. But I could hear an airplane, and if I could, I would get outside until I could see the airplane go over. One of the things that I saw that was probably the most unusual and thrilling thing that I ever saw come across, and you'd only get a small glimpse because you could not look toward the horizon. If an airplane came over at low altitude, it would go from one mountain to the next, and it would be gone. The only thing you could do is hear it off in a distance. But I heard this airplane, and I ran out of the house and looked up, and there was a C-47 pulling a glider. And to my knowledge, that's the only time that during the Second World War, that I ever saw an airplane pulling a glider. So that was a treat. When we moved from the mining camp to the city where we lived, then you could get a vision of the horizon. And during that time, a lot of the guys who were in the Army Air Force from that town, if they were in the area, they would always come and buzz the town, which to me was the greatest air show that I ever saw in my life, especially if they were flying P-51 Mustangs. So the P-51 Mustangs that I'm used to and I saw were the real McCoy, because the guys who were in the Army Air Force, if they were in the area going somewhere, they would always drop down and buzz the town. And I was always disappointed when they left. But not only P-51 Mustangs, but I can remember sitting in the school, and I sat near the window, and I heard this airplane, and I looked out the window, and there was a B-25 with guns. Oops, I hit my microphone. With the tail gunner and the waist gunner. I mean, you could see the whole thing. He was at treetop level, I know, and he was going up the valley, and that was a thrill. That's better than any air show that I've ever seen, because at an air show you're going to see the reproductions. But I saw the real McCoy. And also during the Second World War, when they would have a troop movement going from one location to the other, they would go as a convoy. And we would always get advance notice that the convoy was going to come through our town. Usually they were going to the north, up Highway 25W, which was called the Dixie Highway at the time. And we would get advance notice that these troops were going to be coming by in a convoy. And the streets would be lined with people. And the girls, what they would do is they would write their name and address on a little piece of paper. And when these troops went by, of course, these GIs were just hollering and, going on, because they were all young guys, single. So the girls would throw their address at the GIs, and they would grab them. I bet you didn't know that. And I must have been, during the Second World War, I was between 4 and 7 or 8 years old. So I was getting old enough till I knew what was going on. And sometimes those convoys would be so long that you would stand there and jeeps and trucks going by with tanks. And I mean, this is the real McCoy, because it was during the Second World War. And I think, now I'm not sure on this, my sister probably will not watch this, but I think she was one who did put her name on a piece of paper. And during or after the war, I think one of them contacted her, but it never did amount to anything. But it was a good gesture to these young GIs who were going off to war, and everybody was just together in 100% support of the troops. So I'm fortunate enough, and I'm calling it fortunate, because I happened to witness that part of history, so I didn't have to read about it. My brother was older than me, and I think he turned 18 before the Second World War ended, and he enlisted. And shortly after he enlisted, the war ended, so he never did go overseas and was discharged. I think he was stationed in Fort Lewis, Washington. So that's, and like I say, I probably mentioned this. Anybody that's followed me on YouTube for several years has probably heard some of this. But the YouTube account I have now, the last time I checked, I had 1,080 some subscribers. So I've got a lot of new people who's never heard this stuff before. So that's why I'm repeating it. Well, thank you very much for watching. And I'll do another one probably tomorrow or the next day. Bye-bye.